Now that you know everything about dyes, now we're going to learn how to mix them and how to mix other ancillary solutions. Okay, here's some terminology that we're going to be using through this module that I thought would be helpful for you to know first. The weight of goods, or WOG, is the weight of the dry fiber, whether it's animal fiber, yarn, or fabric. The depth of shade, or the DOS, is the amount of color in dye solution in terms of percent. So 1% is middle of the row color, or the colors usually shown on the dye bottles. 2% and 3% would make a richer, deeper color. Less than 1%, such as 0.5 or 0.25, would produce a pastel or a watered down color. Dye stock is your dye liquid. Dye bath is your water plus your dye stock. Citric acid solution is a 10% mix of citric acid and water. Pre-soaking or wetting out fibers. This is placing your fiber in water to completely wet it prior to dyeing. A salt solution is a 10% mix of Glauber's salt and water. Breaking of dyes is when the colors that are used to make a powder dye color break out into their components, and this can really be quite beautiful. Exhaustion is when all the dye is taken up or attached to the fiber, and then the dye water becomes clear. Maximum saturation is the point where your fiber cannot accept any more dye particles. This will express as the dye not uptaking, your water not being clear, or your fiber bleeding a lot when it's rinsed. Bleeding, the release of dye from the fiber when it's rinsed. This can be due to maximum saturation, or using warm or hot water to rinse food grade or leveling acid dyes, or maybe something else along your dye path was not where it should have been. These are the 4 pillars to dyeing. Your pH, it needs to be at a certain level for that dye to attach to the fiber. Your heat, it needs to be a certain temperature per a certain dye, whether it's leveling or pre-metallized, so heat's super important. Time, I like to call it cooking time. And then the dye to fiber ratio. These 4 things all need to be kept track of at the perfect level for your dyeing results to be amazing. Just a little tip. You may find a US to metric, exchange measuring system really helpful. There's many apps on your cell phone right at your fingertips that will make your life so much easier when you're mixing dyes and working out calculations. So take a peek at your apps on your cell phone and pick something that's right for you. So just a quick little note, just to let you guys know, not all fibers take dye the same way. For instance, if you were using a candy apple red, it may look different on mohair versus fine grade wool versus coarse wool, alpaca, even silk. If you're dyeing a fiber blend, each fiber may take up the dye differently, which can actually be really pretty. So sample and keep a dye record book for your future reference. When we talk about dye color or dye stock, we're going to talk about it as depth of shade, or DOS. You're going to see this quite a bit. So the depth of shade determines the level of color, whether it's light or dark. The depth of shade is a percentage describing the amount of dye used proportional to the dry fiber weight, or called the weight of goods, which is WOG. Again, you're going to see that quite a bit. A 1% depth of shade is the typical saturation used when showing colors on a dye bottle or on a white base. To make a color darker, you would use a 2% depth of shade, for instance. Well, maybe not darker, but richer, just more vibrant. If you wanted to make a color lighter or more pastel, you would use a 0.5% or even a 0.1% depth of shade to get super pastel. So a 0.1% depth of shade is very pale color. 0.5 is a light color. 1% is medium color. 2% is a darker shade, and then the 4% is a deep shade. But of note, I'm not sure if fiber will handle 4% depth of shade because it may reach that maximum saturation, right? It may not absorb all that color. So just keep. Here is the equipment needed to mix your dyes. So please review the dye safety section and use soft water to mix your dyes.